Hi y'all, welcome to my channel, Stranger Stitches, where the stitch counts rarely matter and you can hold your hook any way you want to. We play with yarn and fiber arts and listen to stories. No need to follow along with me or copy my project. Grab whatever you're working on and have a listen.
Today, our story is one that's local to me from long, long ago. Texas had only been a state for about 40 years. Grover Cleveland had been elected president. The Austin and Oatmanville Railway was built to haul limestone from Oatmanville, or what is now Convict Hill, to the basement of the Capitol. I had to soften the wording a little because of YouTube's terms and policies. But honestly, you never know who listens to these videos, and so I agree with not repeating a lot of those descriptions. I personally believe in using the power words for big ideas, but this isn't mine to judge on this platform, and I'm not going to throw down with them, so that said, moving on. Letting y'all know up front, this is only one way to compile the facts and stories surrounding this case. It's well worth a look if you are ever in need of a rabbit hole to go down. In 1884-85, an unidentified person known as the Servant Girl Annihilator, or Midnight Assassin, terrorized Austin, Texas, responsible for 8 deaths. There were also 8 victims that survived. The victims were attacked in their beds as they slept. They were struck in the head with an axe or blunt object, then drug outside, according to the Austin American-Statesman said. Quote, one of the most horrible scenes that ever a reporter was called on to chronicle, end quote. The women were all dragged out into the yard or back premises. All these murders occurred about midnight, in a majority of instances on moonlit nights, and the same mysterious and utterly impenetrable silence, unbroken by sound or cry, reigned while the assassin was at his terrible work. As published by Austin Daily Statesman, May 30, 1886. These deaths occurred 75 years before the term serial killer was coined. It still gave Austin the sorry reputation to be named as the first city in America to have one. 3 years before Jack the Ripper and 8 years before H.H. Holmes. Holmes, it has been said, was the first, but after listening to this story, I leave that up you. William Sidney Porter, better known as O. Henry, was living in Austin at the time and coined the name Servant Girl Annihilator. In an 1885 letter to his friend David Hall, he says, and I quote, "Town is fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids of the servant girl annihilators, who make things lively in the dull hours of the night." End quote. Sounds like O. Henry is taking this pretty lightly. Later, the letter was included in a short story compilation in Rolling Stones, published 1912. If that letter not been reprinted, the crimes might have been completely forgotten. However, no contemporary newspaper or published source referred to the killer by that name at that time. David Hall, I hope you ghosted him and got better friends, so... Oh, Henry, you're a jerk and your stories just aren't that clever. I said what I said. Looking at the book The Midnight Assassin by Skip Hollandsworth. It's well written with loads of pertinent information. He writes, and I quote, "When 3 years later, a man nicknamed Jack the Ripper carried out a similar series of killings in the Whitechapel district of London, England. The Scotland Yard detectives speculated that he was the Austin killer who had traveled overseas to continue to carry out his diabolical work." End quote. Frickin' goosebumps. Reports at the time described the assassin as a cunning madman obsessed with killing women. The conjecture was that the Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were one and the same. This originated in October 1888, when an editor with the Atlanta Constitution suggested the idea following the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes by Jack the Ripper. The Annihilator took 8 people, 7 women and 1 man, and seriously wounded 8 others. Either he was most likely interrupted or had left the survivors for dead. All victims were attacked in their beds with an axe or blunt implement, indoors while sleeping, with women dragged outside and 3 brutally mutilated. S.A. Victims were similarly posed. 6 of the women had sharp objects inserted into their ears and through their brains. I couldn't find anything else about the positioning of the victims, only that the Ripper and the Annihilator were nearly carbon copies of each other. So yeah, as demeaning as possible. Don't let your mind stay there. Some sources say there was evidence of SAA that detail wasn't widely published at the time. Take a moment to remember the youngest victim, Mary Ramey. She was 11. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry that happened to you. From a Texas true crime article written by Maya Beeson, we know that W.B. Dunham, a journalist for the Texas Court Reporter, was woken up by a cry from their quarters out back. Dunham's cook, a young woman named Gracie Vance, lived in the shed with Orange Washington, her boyfriend. In addition, they had two young women staying with them for the time being, Patsy Gibson and Lucinda Body. Figuring that Orange and Gracie were having a tussle, Dunham went to the back door and hollered at them to be quiet. Several minutes later, he heard a cry, so he grabbed his pistol and stepped outside. At the same time, Lucinda Body stumbled out of the shack, her head bloody, and screamed, "Mr. Dunham, we're all dead!" The community of voodoo practitioners in Austin had a theory. The perpetrator was a white male wielding the power of invisibility. That explained the silence of neighborhood dogs who were usually quick to sound the alarm. Or maybe they were being fed. We'll talk about why I think that in a little bit. A multi-point strategy was put to work. A surge in law enforcement personnel, big rewards offered for information, and a muster of a citizens' protective force patrolling the streets. The slayings stopped between December and May. Subsequent news accounts indicated the responsible party had mysteriously vanished from the vicinity, creating a false sense of security, but leaving the official record as unsolved. So, far as we know, he took a break between December and May and then started again. The spree ended with the Christmas Eve 1885 murders of two women, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock. Moses Hancock was accused, then acquitted of his wife's demise. James Phillips, Eula Phillips' husband, caught the charge for her and was convicted, but the conviction was later overturned. Did Moses and James know each other and make a plan to get rid of their wives? Did they time it so the Annihilator would get blamed? No idea, and it's a stretch, but who knows? Weird things happen. It's likely the Annihilator did these too. Either way, he was given credit. According to a July 2000 article in the Texas Monthly, there were several eyewitness accounts who claimed to have seen the Annihilator, but reported contradictory information to the police. The killer was variously reported to have been white or dark-complexioned, or a yellow man wearing lamp black to conceal his skin color, or a man wearing an old-fashioned prairie dress, or a man wearing a slouch hat, or a man wearing a hat and a white rag that covered the lower part of his face. There were also reports that there was an accomplice, or a gang. So, information was coming from all over the place and absolutely no help at all. The only clue police did have was footprints and the word of Eliza Shelley's 8-year-old son. He couldn't remember exactly what happened, and he couldn't remember what the attacker looked like, just that he wore a white rag over his face. The child had just witnessed the death of his mother. Of course, he couldn't remember. Okay. So about the evidence they did have, the footprints. At that time, apart from general measurements of size and shape, footprints in most instances are not especially helpful, and they would not have been much use to the authorities had they not possessed some unusual feature. But there were, and big ones, distinctive impressions made by the perpetrator as he carried the weight of the victims outdoors. The right foot had only 4 toes, missing a pinky toe and another distinctive deformity, a club foot, both on the right side. So we also know that the Annihilator attacked in his bare feet, because going barefoot would make his movement more silent. The authorities never shared this fact with the press or the general public during the course of 1885. The newspapers frequently complained about the secrecy surrounding the inquests and argued that making all the details of the crimes public would facilitate the capture of the responsible parties more quickly. Law enforcement disagreed and kept certain details close to the vest, details that they hoped would eventually identify the perpetrator and link him to the crime scenes. Side note, I also did some research that the Annihilator was the reason. For the Austin moon towers were put up, I found no connection. The first moon tower went up 1894, 1895, 10 years after these crimes. A safety measure for sure, but too late for this case. 8-year-old cook, Nathan Elgin, who worked in close proximity to the crime scenes. Shortly after the last murder, Elgin was shot and killed by police while he was attempting to assault a young girl with a knife. This is why I think the dogs were being fed. Nathan would have had access to a lot of scrap food. Late one night in February 1886, at a saloon in Masontown in East Austin, there was a scene of a violent and brutal episode. The neighborhood was in an uproar because a man, reported to be 3 sheets to the wind, and in a rage dragged a young girl from the saloon to a nearby house where he could be heard beating and cussing her while she screamed for her life. The entire neighborhood had come out in the streets and caught the attention of a nearby police officer. Officer John Bracken arrived on the scene, and the saloon keeper, Dick Rogers, and a neighbor, Clabe Hawkins, went in with Bracken to stop the man from beating the girl to death. Rogers and Hawkins went into the house and pulled the man off the girl and dragged him into the front yard. There's some irony. As Rogers and Hawkins struggled with the man, Officer Bracken broke out the handcuffs, but the man would not be subdued. He threw off Rogers and Hawkins and sent Bracken ass over tea kettle. The man then turned on them and threatened them with a knife. Bracken recovered and a shot was fired. His shot stopped the struggle. There was no explanation for Elgin's rage at the girl. Her name was Julia. Bracken's shot did not kill Elgin, outright, but it did leave him paralyzed and fatally wounded. He died the following day. A subsequent autopsy revealed that Bracken's bullet had lodged in Elgin's spine, which accounted for the paralysis. The doctors had also noticed another detail. Elgin was missing a pinky toe on his right foot. The murders stopped. Few records exist on Nathan Elgin. The crime scene data strongly suggests an anger retaliatory homicidal profile, matching these characteristics. The attacks involving overkill, symbolic revenge on women, stemming from the perpetrator's resentment. This results in episodic, violent outbursts aimed at retribution. All fit so far. Additionally, Nathan Elgin would have had the locational expertise, essential to successfully enacting the murders and ditching the authorities, creating a signature. Kill style. The attack on sleeping victims using blunt force or axe to the head, carrying the body away from the house into the yard where the victim was then. R word. The Elgin family had moved to Austin from Arkansas after the war, to the freedmen's community that came to be known as Wheatville. Nathan had 3 older siblings that had already married, started their own families, and evidently lived normal lives while Nathan was still a child growing up in Austin. However, the older sibling's mother, Angeline, was a different woman than Nathan's mother, Susan. The 1880 census recorded 14-year-old Nathan Elgin, a literate domestic servant, living with his parents. Likely placed in service by Susan, he endured the rigid Victorian household regime, subservient to both black and white women. His clubfoot might have relegated him to this role, deemed unsuitable for strenuous labor, a circumstance potentially humiliating and conducive to abuse. Given the preponderance of female domestic staff, Nathan likely faced crap from men in his community. None of this excuses his actions, and I don't mean it to cushion the gravity of the deeds, just to exploring where it came from. Mary Ramey, age 11. Eula Phillips was 17 and mother of a 1-year-old. Molly Smith. Walter Spencer was seriously wounded. Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, seriously wounded. 19th March 1885, Eliza Shelley was killed in the presence of at least one of her children. Irene Cross Clara Dick was seriously wounded. Mary, Gracie Vance, Orange Washington, Patsy Gibson, Lucinda Body, 28th September 1885. Susan Hancock on the night of 24th December 1885. These are the ones we know about. Based solely on this information given in this case could be solved to my satisfaction. However, it is still listed as unsolved. It's an open case. So y'all, I'm keeping my mind open. What do we not know that keeps the case open for over 140 years? I'm ready to listen. And when I find out, I'll let y'all know. I used Find a Grave to locate where the victims are buried. Most are in Oakwood Cemetery 6601, Navasota Street, Austin, Texas. Maybe look them up and take some flowers or a cup of tea. Thank you for joining me. Like, subscribe, share, do all the things. See you soon.